This is Dr. Charles Parker, and you're listening to Core Brain Journal. It's a place where I connect both fresh discoveries and interesting different perspectives from advanced mind science with the realities of real people and everyday life down on Main Street. Welcome, folks. Here we are one more time at Core Brain Journal. We are very interested today. This is going to be a transformational conversation because it's an odd subject, to tell you the truth, and it's something that a lot of us really have never heard about. It has to do with musical healing. And our guest today is Alex Doman. He is get this, he's out in Ogden, Utah. He's looking at the mountains right now. And welcome, Alex. We're really looking forward to talking to you.
Great to be here, Chuck. Happy to be here.
So what we're going to talk about is, Alex, to just do a brief introduction for him. Alex is the co-founder, is the founder and CEO of Advanced Brain Technologies, co-founder of Sleep Genius, and best-selling co-author of Healing at the Speed of Sound. We're going to talk about healing at the speed of sound, and if you stay tuned here through this episode, we're going to tell you Alex has been very kind to offer 5 signed copies of his book, Healing at the Speed of Sound, at the close of this, and we'll tell you how to get into a drawings where, after you're stimulated to think about it, you can chase down the book. Thank you very much, Alex.
It's my pleasure.
So, a little more on who he is as a person. He is in the 3rd generation of a family of pioneers in the field of child and human brain development. He's focused his career on sound, music, digital health, and technology, and the capacity to improve brain health and performance through sound. It's really a music healing, as we were talking about. His production credits are copious, and to include just a few things, I'll mention them. Co-producer of Music for Healing at the Speed of Sound. This is something I'm interested in too, Alex. I hope we can talk a little bit about music for babies. And in time, an executive producer, creator, collaborator on numerous other projects and technologies, including the listening program, Brain Builder, Sound Health, and many more. We're not going to spend a lot of time. Let's just say he's been interviewed by everybody. He's got great sound equipment out there we were talking about before we got started, but he's been on NBC, CBS, ABC, MSNBC, Today, NPR Marketplace. To say it in a brief word, Alex gets around and he knows what he's talking about. So stay tuned. Let's get into it. Alex, give us just a little more of a picture about who you are personally. Tell us a little more about your personal life, if you will.
Well, on a proximity note, you shared I'm in Ogden, Utah. I've got this beautiful view of the Wasatch Mountains. I've been living here for 23 years now after a exodus from Los Angeles, and I never looked back after making that decision. And I started my company here, Advanced Brain Technologies, in 1998. Met my beautiful wife, Mandy, who works with me here in the business and has so for 15 years. And here we're raising our 3 boys. 2016 are my stepsons, and then we've got a beautiful 6-year-old boy that we're raising together, and we're having a great time here.
Fantastic. It sounds beautiful. There's no opportunity for outdoor sports out there, I'm sure.
None whatsoever. We've got the best hiking trail system right out our back door, and world-class ski resorts and reservoirs for water skiing. You name it, it's here in our backyard. No,
it's beautiful. I've been out there, and we're a little envious, as I was telling you before we started. So, Alex, tell us a little bit about this, because the concept for most of our listeners, I'm sure, and myself included a little bit, because I've heard about it vaguely, but I'd like to know more about music healing, how you got into it. Where did you have that transformational moment that just made you dive into that subject?
Well, interestingly enough, I've, grown up in a family that's been in the brain business, Chuck. And when I say that, my grandfather was a rehabilitation physician. And he and my great uncle were 2 of the pioneers of brain injury rehabilitation. My father, his sister, cousins, everybody grew up in some facet working in this space of helping people optimize their potential. So growing up in this environment where you are surrounded by psychologists, child developmentalists, neurosurgeons, and some of the best minds in the world on the brain, before the field of neuroscience came to be, that you look at the world through a different lens. And that lens was, we have this amazing capacity for potential, and none of us know what it is. So as a family, our mission has always been to help people realize it, whatever that is, be it a brain injured child, a child on the autism spectrum, an adult suffering from a stress disorder, a child with an learning or attentional problem. How do we look at that individual holistically and help them with a game plan to get to that next stage, whatever it might be?
Very, very interesting. So then you came from a terrific foundation. Yes, you had influence from your parents and others, but what was it that hit you that where you actually said, okay, this is for me. This is something darn interesting that I want to get into and share and grow with?
It was my own personal challenge with a deficit in auditory processing.
Oh, is that right?
It was. I joined my father in his practice back in '93, and at the National Association for Child Development, and they had been using sound-based methods from Europe with his caseload for many, many years. And I came in to do clinical research on these programs with his clients. And during that process, in my own use, I found healing. And I found recovery with two areas that I really were challenged by. One was hyperacusis, where I was overly sensitive to certain sounds that you would find wouldn't bother you, and also tinnitus, where I had ringing in my ears. And both of these were subsequent to being set up with early childhood ear infections, and looking in the rear view, my casein and gluten intolerance that wasn't looked at back in the early 70s was likely a highly contributing factor. And then the wrong habits as a teenager with music listening at live events led to an acoustic trauma. So
doggone, yep.
I had a weak system that was susceptible. I injured it. I suffered the consequences, and I found relief in my own research.
See, that is so interesting you're bringing this up, because intuitively, I've never heard it from an expert, to be honest with you, but I've had issues of tinnitus and thought about it, and I think there's something here that's more than what I'm able to understand. And I think it has something to do because they have other immune system dysregulations, and we would measure them, but I haven't really been absolutely successful at dealing with them because I didn't really understand it enough. And I'm not an acoustic expert. So how did you actually then come up with that next important step of how to approach it?
Well, it was very pragmatic because we were working with programs that required the individual to go to a clinic to physically receive services. And we've always been focused on a home-based model where somebody is set up for success. So in our home environment is generally, if we're in a safe environment, where we feel most comfortable, most at ease, less defensive, as opposed to bringing a child into a clinic and they see a white coat and they throw up because they've seen one too many and the experience is never too good when they walk into the office and they're being poked and prodded. So our interest was in developing something home-based that we could empower the family to do, to have the power of music-based therapies, but in the comfort, in the convenience of the home. So we could touch more lives, we could reduce the costs, make it more affordable, and achieve our ultimate vision, which for me was to impact every life possible through the power of sound.
That is very, very interesting. Now, did you have, that's the idea. Then let's take it down to a learning experience that would help us even take it closer to the reality of your growing experience as a young man. Did you see, where did you start? Did you start with an autistic child? Did you start, obviously you started somewhat with yourself.
I started somewhat with myself, but actually it's interesting. It was the work with the children with autism that had the most profound impact with me, one-on-one. First of all, most of these, and I don't want to generalize because a label does not define an individual and who they are and what their potential is. But generally speaking, in working with kids on the spectrum, they were my greatest process of discovery because it was most of these kids were nonverbal. It was reading body language and watching behavioral responses to the therapies that I was providing that began to turn the lights on in terms of needs for change. And what was interesting is that a lot of these children, in response to the therapies, were going into fight or flight responses. So the therapy that was designed to help them was actually stressing their system. So then I began modifying the protocols and changing the delivery and finding methods and means in which their system would be calmed rather than raising arousal. So through that process, there was a conception of a new model of music listening therapy that would provide the change for the brain, but within a safe container.
That is so interesting, very, very interesting. So what are the could you give us a couple of axioms that would apply to the technology that you use regarding what is acceptable for a vulnerable individual?
Well, safety first. Music and sound are very powerful modalities, and they are intrinsic to who we are. If we really think about ourselves as human beings, we're wired for sound. The first sense to fully develop in utero is our balance and hearing mechanism in the inner ear. So there's a developmental priority given to our hearing and balance system in the cochlea and the vestibular system. So we have our first learning experiences through movement and listening in utero and then post-birth. So to set it up, this is a very important sensory system that we experience. Second, sound hits us 24/7, 365. We have no earlets. Our system is always open, whether we're conscious or unconscious, sleep or awake. We're processing these inputs all of the time. So it's a powerful system that we must treat with respect. So in treating it with respect, it's finding that just right amount of stimulation to guide the brain through novelty to begin to change in the direction of the behaviors that we want without overstimulating that system. So if you visualize a teeter-totter and you have, somebody that's 400 pounds on one side and somebody that's 90 pounds on the other, we have to find just that right balance to keep it in the air without one drop into the ground or the other one flying off, and that's our arousal system. So that we don't over-arouse or under-arouse an individual, so that we can get to a state of change without overstimulation. And that comes through the duration of the training, the intensity of the stimuli, the volume that we're listening at, and the context of the experience are all really important factors.
So you probably also, while I'm listening to you, I'm imagining a mother working with her child there and thinking about the instructions, because you were kind of implicitly giving some instructions there that might be relevant, or here are some signs when that child is too engaged. Now, of course, an intuitive mother's going to get that anyway. That's not going to need. But on the other hand, this is what you would anticipate if it's really working might be something that you would say, because all of us, no matter what we do, whether it's psychopharmacology or supplements or sound, we're looking for that window that has a measure of therapeutic alliance where we're actually connected with the individual. And then we want to be able to assess, is that person indeed making progress. What's our criteria for progress? Could you tell us a little more about the criteria for progress and how you might see that in a vulnerable individual like that?
So as we're working, with people generally that have a neurological disorder, if you will, they're all vulnerable, and each are to a certain degree. So you set up a framework of a systematic approach, which we've created for our programs, where you go from lower intensity to higher intensity training. You then, based on the profile of that individual, select a protocol that, based on your collective experiences, tell you this is the right starting point. Then you initiate the therapeutic process. And what we're looking for, first of all, is an enjoyable experience. We want a positive response, an association to the intervention, so that that individual is intrinsically motivated to come back to it. So the first experience emotionally is very critical because it sets the stage for the interventions going forward. Mm-hmm. So we really work very closely with what we call our listeners in setting that right context and setting the stage. And then we delve into therapy, which is 15 minutes once or twice daily during an enjoyable activity, something that would be enjoyable for that individual. So again, positive context and association. And what we look for to say, is this paradigm working, is first of all, what's the mood and arousal response during the protocols? Mm-hmm. So are we activating somebody? Are we shutting them down? Is mood elevating? Is mood depressing? So our first response is, what was the mood and arousal level during the session? Mm-hmm. And then we're watching behavior subsequent to intervention during the day to see, are things changing that are out of the norm? And we don't judge it. We just collect the data, and we give the resources in order to collect that data. Then we look at that cumulatively over time. Then we look for inflection points in the therapy. We should see more significant changes. And what those changes are very specific to that individual based on what we're working on for them. So if it's a child with speech and language difficulties, those are our benchmarks. If it's a mother, and many of our listeners are mothers or women with stress disorders, for example, what's their stress regulation look like, and how are we measuring that, and how are we moving the needle?
Very, very interesting. So then individuals, children, adults, who are relatively desynchronized from verbal expression and assimilation of directions and thoughts coming through sound, could get synchronized in this process so that you could actually see them advance in their abilities to handle that sort of material.
Certainly. What we're really doing is priming the brain for all of its functions and activities, from a subcortical to a cortical level. So think of music listening training as a primer for our general brain function, from the lowest unconscious processes to the higher order thinking.
So interesting. Yes. When you were talking about the intrauterine experience, and I can't remember the composer, I don't know if it was George Gershwin, but the point was, and I heard this a long time ago when I was studying psychoanalysis in Philadelphia, one of the analysts brought it up, that one of the reasons he developed a syncopated rhythm is because his mother had a heart flutter defect.
and he entrained to it.
Yeah, he was ready to go when he came out. So, well, that takes us back to this other question about babies, because what you're saying then is you can actually, as you said in Train, you could do something even with very young children to help them assimilate information. Could you tell us, that's so interesting, could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, and I think it's important as we delve into that topic to make a disclaimer. We're not of the camp that listening to Mozart makes your baby smarter.
Okay, that was one of the hidden questions. I'm glad you clarified that point.
So let's dispel that idea. Okay. So what we're looking at is we're looking at providing the brain with the sensory input that it needs to perform its functions. So let's take frequency processing, for example, which is one of the cores of how we perceive language. The ear and the brain have a frequency map for a range of tones from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. And that map is represented in our ear as well as in structures leading up to the cortex. That's a tonotopic organization. I want you to think about keys on a piano, that each key is a different note, and it crosses a broad range of sound frequency. Now, in order for the brain to learn how to process and understand frequency, it needs exposure to sound frequencies. So the input that we experience early in life lays down the neural map for the processing of sound. So the application of music listening therapies early in life is to help create that tonotopic organization so that we have a good, stable base in which to develop receptive and expressive language upon.
I'm so glad you repeated that word, Alex, because that's a new word for my vocabulary. That tonotopic. Could you just tease apart what that is, please?
Sure. So in your ear, you have an organ called the cochlea. That's the hearing organ. And that spiral-shaped structure has several thousand hair cells. Each of those hair cells, or groups of hair cells, have a home frequency, a certain frequency of sound that they're responsible for transmitting to the brain. So, say for example, you have low tones, mid-range sounds, and high sounds. A low tone could be a vowel sound in our voice or a trombone. A high tone could be a violin or the sibilants or the higher frequencies within our voice, as an example. And from low frequencies to high frequencies and all the way in between, there's a mapping in our ear. Then there are groups of brain cells in the cortex that receive those sounds and that we then consciously recognize the sound.
I see.
So it's a mapping, and that map, we're all given the hardware, if you will, okay, the gray matter to process sound, and we're going to reinforce that function in the white matter, the transfer of that information based on our experience with sound. And the best way to really discuss it is sensory deprivation. If you take a newborn and you put them in a soundproof room without stimulus, they won't hear, despite having the equipment to do so. So sensory deprivation over time will suppress the system's ability to use those functions. So the contra is to provide the sufficient input so the system is optimally ready to do its job.
Very interesting. Now, what about this other dimension? The children are interesting. I mean, there's so much here that's very stimulating. We got to talk some more somewhere down the road because there's so many additional things that start to come to mind. I'm sure the readers will have some questions, but I mean the listeners now. But I'm thinking about the other end of life. What about individuals who are slowly going deaf? And of course, deafness has many causes, but what's your thought about that end of the spectrum?
We can train the brain across the age and functional continuum. So regardless of our years in life or our level of perceived function, there's one thing we all have in common, and there's nowhere but up. We can each improve. Yeah, and we have practitioners that work primarily with geriatric patients with our protocols. And in these cases, say that age-related hearing loss, which is called presbycusis, is often a matter of noise exposure and habits in life. So the first idea is by having healthy listening habits, we can preserve our hearing for longer, barring genetic and other causes of hearing loss. So an interesting observation as our aging population begins to lose hearing, there appears to be a correlation between hearing and mood and arousal. And that as hearing begins to diminish, we begin to see mood changes, we see energy changes, and in this population, when we begin to use music listening therapy, we begin to see a light to turn back on, and a smile come back on the face, and increased energy, because I believe we're supplying the brain with input it desperately seeks. But when we lose hearing, we need an aid. And that aid is a very directed stimulation program that's going to help provide the brain that input. So it's not possible to restore the lost hearing, but it is possible to improve the listening with what function that we have.
Very interesting again. I'm sorry to be a bit effusive about this, but it's so new information. I'm sure a lot of people are very pleased to be hearing this, because everything you're saying is so completely right on. Now let me ask you this next question, which I'm sure others are thinking about, and that is, what's the technology? What do you actually do with the person? Do you test them on the front end, and then do you use earphones? What do you do with the whole thing?
So what it looks like, and the methodology is called the listening program, Chuck, is functional intake is done, essentially questionnaires, and depending on the individual's needs, there may be standardized assessments of auditory processing, of psychosocial function, of academic function, of stress regulation. Depends on the purpose for the protocol. Mm-hmm. Once we've done that baseline, then the correct protocol from a series of different programs is selected that best matches that individual's needs. There's a discussion about their time availability. This is a daily program. It's done 5 days a week. 15 to 30 minutes, and it's done over the course of 50 to 100 hours of training for a baseline program. So you're going to do a base program over the course of several months. The equipment is a digital media player that has a personal music library that's loaded on it. You receive a protocol where you're instructed on which music to listen to, which day, and then you listen to that through a very high-end audio system that we've developed that actually delivers the music not only to your ears, but vibrationally through your body through something called bone conduction. So you actually feel the music while you're listening to it, and that bone conduction helps to calm the nervous system and make it more receptive to the music that you're listening to. So you put on your headset in the morning or in the evening, you do a 15-minute session during a quiet, relaxing activity. You do that 5 days a week over the course of time, following a very specific progression of different music listening through different sound frequency ranges.
So now another question has come up. That sounds very easy to do, and as you said, it's home-based. That's exciting for many people, I'm sure. Now, what happens with this other dimension, and that is expressive language? When a person has this protocol, are they better with expressive language as a result?
It's a great question, and I want to take you back to the research of kind of the father of this field was a French ENT named Dr. Alfred Tomatis, and he's best known for something which is called the Tomatis effect, which was a discovery he made in his clinical work in Paris in the 50s, and that is that the voice can only reproduce the sounds the ear can perceive. Mm-hmm. So it's a function of input predicts output. So as we improve the receptive capacities, we then have a better opportunity for expressive improvements along with it. So it's about feeding the brain with the input that it needs so it understands what to express to better express it.
Very interesting. Another interesting point. So all of this is really quite stimulating. Let me ask you a little bit, it's not a negative, but do you have any cautionary notes that come to mind that you've experienced in your work in this field that would say, this is not the way to proceed with this particular thing, or this is something I just wouldn't jump into on this occasion, that just doesn't work?
Yeah, I'll tell you where we hesitate. And it has to do with the environment and the support system that the individual has available to them. So, we train practitioners worldwide, and these practitioners hold the hand of the listener. So they're providers, and they set up the protocols, and they monitor, and they answer questions, and they hold the hand of that family member that's carrying out the program, or the practitioner that may be assisting them. And if that individual is in an environment that is not supportive and ready for change, we really proceed cautiously, because sometimes you're careful what you wish for, and that nonverbal child begins to get verbal and express themselves. You may not appreciate what's going to come out of their mouth. And I say that from experience that, one of our goals was to improve expressive language, and parents get upset about how Johnny's expressing himself. Well, he's got to learn now how to apply a filter to what he wants to share. And as a parent, you're going to help him understand that. But the emotional growth that can come as somebody's listening capabilities begin to expand, inner listening and external listening, can be very transformative. And in that transformation, it's really best that somebody has a great support system as they're going through that change.
I mean, this has been so terribly interesting. I'm going to tell listeners real quickly how they can enter the drawing. If they go to corebrainjournal.com/046drawing, 046 drawing, Alex, as I said previously, is going to give away 5 signed copies of his book, Healing at the Speed of Sound. I'm sure there are a number of people that are going to jump on this, because I'm just talking to you. This is the first time I've really understood anything about this. I've heard about it, very distantly. And I'm thinking of people just coming to my mind, people that I have seen that I was flummoxed about what to do. I got some of the stuff right because we got the immune thing squared away. We know we're working with them, but everything you've said, every question I've asked really had a person in mind. Here's another person that could use this. And I think that's very likely what's going on with our listeners as well. I'd be surprised if it wasn't. So, thank you very much again for those books. And in closing, let me ask you, Alex, where would you send people? Let's get your, I'm going to put it in the show notes. We're going to have copious show notes on you, but we'll talk about your website. And if you have any specific things that you think a person should do who's become interested in this, where should they go? Let's start with your website, please.
The website is advancedbrain.com. That's advancedbrain.com. The site is deep. There are webinars, there are teleseminars, there are scientific papers, case studies. You could spend a weekend on that site and not get bored. So that's a great place for an initial deep dive. Secondary to that, to understand the science and the applications of the power of sound in music in general, it would be the book Healing at the Speed of Sound. And that's available in all formats.
Well, that's great. I love that phrase, all formats. It means you don't have to spell it out. Amazon's done such a good job of hitting every doggone format. Well, It's really been a pleasure talking to Alex Doman, and really fantastic information, and we just really appreciate you taking the time. We're going to be back again. This has been so educational. That's the reason we're doing Core Brain Journal, is to get the word out on really outstanding people like yourself who have different answers to questions that just really everybody thought they were flummoxed about, and this is so good. Thank you for taking the time.
Chuck, an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much.
We'll have you back. Thanks for listening to Core Brain Journal. We're working every day behind the scenes to bring you reports that connect research benches with those street trenches. Here we share the complexity of mind science because, as you know, details really do matter. One of the most pervasive, misunderstood challenges is how commonplace medications, like those written for ADHD, are used so regularly without clear guidelines. If you think you'd like more specifics, take a minute to download my 2-page PDF packed with video links and references on the absolute essentials of how to start ADHD medications. They're easily available at corebrainjournal.com/start. Thanks for listening. Do connect and stay tuned. Together we can make it.